Okay, so we're going to do Chapter 9 homework. Before we even start looking at some of the problems, we need to review a couple things. So Chapter 9 is concentrating on trade, and to view and look at trade, the benefits, we can use a regular supply and demand schedule and consumer and producer surplus. So what's in front of you here on the screen, you'll see I've drawn a supply curve and a demand curve. And this would just be regular supply and demand. So we would figure out equilibrium point is where supply and demand intersect. So that would be the price charged in the market would be $10, and the quantity demanded and quantity supplied at that equilibrium price would be 100 units. So as a reminder, consumer surplus is the benefit that consumers gain from the market, and producer surplus is the benefit that the producer gained from the market. And if you remember, when we're talking about gains, it's when the market price is determined, everyone gets to pay the same price. So in this case, it's $10. But if we refer to the demand curve, we can see there were people like up here at this point here are willing to pay more than the $10, and at this point there's people that are willing to pay more than the $10 and so forth. So this triangular area right here, that's the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is everything below a demand curve and above the price level. Producer surplus is the same kind of idea. It's the gains that the firms receive from the market, because again, you've got firms that would have put and sold product down here at this price, but they get $10 for this unit, and at this point they would have been willing to sell it for that price, but they get $10. So the producer surplus is everything below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. So it's this triangular area. So we have consumer and producer surplus. Mathematically, to get the areas of a triangle, it's 1/2 base times height. So for the consumer surplus, I've labeled the height would be the difference between the equilibrium price and up to that maximum point. So that's $10. And the base is from 0 to 100. And if we take 1/2 base times height, we end up with a consumer surplus of 500. We do the same for the producer surplus. It will be from 0 to 10, and then from 0 to 100, and so our producer surplus ends up in this case being the same. It's 1/2 times 100 times 10. Producer surplus ends up being 500. So that's a quick review of consumer and producer surplus. Okay, so we're going to quickly review here, looking at trade from the viewpoint with a closed economy, which means no trade, and then an economy with trade. And in this situation, the first example will be when the world price is below the equilibrium. So in a closed economy, when we have no trade, it will just be the US supply and the US demand curves, and we'll produce an equilibrium. We're going to assume we allow the market to determine the price and quantity. And as we just reviewed, we would have, a consumer surplus, and we would have a producer surplus. With trade, when we open ourselves up to the rest of the world, and we call that an open economy, what we're now doing is taking advantage of what others have to offer in both regards. It could be we have benefits to offer other countries, and other countries have benefits to offer us. So in the scenario right here, what I've done is I've put that the world price, so the price of this particular good, is cheaper in the world than it is in the US without trade. And ultimately what that ends up meaning in the world, or for the US I should really say, is that it means that the world is able to actually produce this product cheaper than the US firms are, because the world price is lower. And so using consumer and producer surplus, what we want to briefly look at here is visually what that means and does to our consumer and producer surplus. So just intuitively think about this. If the rest of the world can offer this product at a lower price than the US can, the US firms, then most likely what we should see is U.S. domestic consumers will benefit from this because they can now buy this product at a lower price. And U.S. firms are probably going to lose a little because they're not able to produce the good as cheap as the world price, comma, all else constant. So sure enough, I'm going to just scroll here a little bit. If you look at, again, the visual, look what happens to the consumer surplus. No trade, and then with trade, with the lower price, because remember, consumer surplus is everything below demand and above the price. So with the new world price, look what happens to consumer surplus. It becomes a much bigger triangle. But then, from the producer surplus standpoint, it's the price below and above their supply. And so their producer surplus is much smaller than the original because the price that they'll be willing to put out at is lower now than previously. So the producer surplus declines. Also, as a quick reminder, anytime your world price is below the equilibrium price, it does imply that foreigners can produce it cheaper, so that means the U.S. can benefit from trade by importing or bringing in the foreign goods. If we go to the next case, so I'll scroll down. So again, we'll start off, no trade. So we'll have our consumer surplus and our producer surplus areas. Then we open ourselves up for trade. Now notice in this scenario, what I've done is the world price is up here. It's above the equilibrium. So think about that. If the world price is above, that means that U.S. firms are actually able to produce this good cheaper than at the world. So if the U.S. starts selling to the world, they can benefit from this because they can get a higher price out in the world market. So sure enough, if we open ourselves up to trade, the higher world price, look what happens here to consumer surplus. Well, all the consumers now are having to pay a higher price. So their consumer surplus, the area becomes smaller, while the firms in the U.S. will benefit from this because they can now, at this higher world price, they'll put more out on the market. So their producer surplus area will become much bigger. So this means when the world price is higher or above the equilibrium, that means that the U.S. will want to export or sell their product overseas. And that means consumer surplus goes down and producer surplus will go up. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick look at a couple questions in the Cengage, Chapter 9. So we'll click on for the first question and it will pull up this problem. And you're told that the world price of wine is below the price that would prevail in Canada. So this is the Canadian market for wine. And so without trade, as we just looked at, they'd be right here in equilibrium at this point where the cursor is. However, the world price is below. So what you want to remember here is that what that means. So if the world price is below the equilibrium market of the domestic market, that means the world price can do it cheaper, which means this country is going to want to import or bring in that foreign good because it's cheaper in the world. So think about it before you start actually approaching this question. It's asking you to look at what happens to the consumer and producer surplus with the trade. So if the world price is lower, who's going to benefit here is what you want to be thinking about. Well, that's going to be the consumer. And who's not going to benefit so much is going to be the producer. So to answer this question, I think you'll be able to do it. But I'm just going to quickly show you. You're going to right-click on this little icon thing and drag it. It's a little tricky if you've not done it before. And then you're just going to start, coloring in where you think it needs to go and so on. And I think you'll be okay with the rest of this question. Okay, we'll continue on to the second question. Okay, this question is a little bit tricky. It's not too bad, but what I'm going to do on this question is I have a handout that we're going to refer to, and I'm going to help you along with how to interpret and read this. Okay, so on this question, it first can appear to be a little tricky, but it just looks messier than it actually is. So you want to just be keeping in mind on this is we're looking at consumer and producer surplus. So even though everything, all these different boxes are labeled, it's really this is all we're doing. So the question starts out that the world price, you've got some world price called world price, and it's going to ask you what is the consumer and producer surplus at the original world price, and then what happens to the world price when the US, let's say in this case, imposes a tariff, which remember is an extra tax on the foreign goods. So when you impose a tariff or a tax on a world price, what it does is it causes the world price to increase to this new higher level. So the entire point of this question is just looking at what happens in a market when we impose tariffs on foreign goods. So what I've done here is I have before the tariff and after the tariff. So this is assuming in both cases we are trading. So before the tariff, what we see is we'd be at our original world price and we would be producing at Q1. The US firms would produce at Q1 at this world price, meaning that's what they put out on the market. And at this world price, Q4 would represent what US consumers would be willing to pay in the world at this nice world price. Once the tariff is put in place, what happens is it drives up the world price, meaning it makes the foreign goods coming into the US go up in price. And who wants to benefit or would want to kind of push for that would be the US firms, because you basically just made the foreign good more expensive in your country. So looking again at the visual at this new world price, what do we see? Well, we now see that US firms will actually be able to put more out now, because at that new world price, that higher price, they'll put more out at Q2. And US consumers won't purchase quite as much because it costs them more now, so we go to Q3. So then the rest of the question is asking you to say, okay, we want to see what happens before and after the tariff with the consumer and producer surplus. And so you can take a look at this, but I just want you to see that before the tariff, our consumer surplus, reminder, is everything below demand and above the price. So whatever world price you're looking at, you're doing the same thing. You're looking below demand and above the world price. And you'll do the same with the producer surplus, only in that case, it's everything below the world price and above the supply curve. So you're going to look for the before tariff, what the consumer and producer surplus areas are, and then after the tariff, what happens to the producer and consumer surpluses. What I am going to point out here, I'm just going to scroll down just a tad. There's an interesting thing that happens when tariffs are imposed in a market, and this is why economists, for the most part, are opposed or against tariffs being imposed on foreign goods coming into a country, because it ends up creating this thing called a deadweight loss. And that's a situation where neither the consumer nor the firm, and in this case we're also going to include the government, gets to benefit from this area. So what happens is when we look at the before and after consumer and producer surplus area, a couple things happen. So I'm just going to point this out, and this is something you'll want to think about yourself. So at the world price, with no tariff, this is the quantity US firms would produce, but now with the tariff, they'll produce this amount, so they're producing more. And then the difference here from the firms, or excuse me, the difference here from the consumer standpoint is without the tariff, they would have been purchasing this amount, but now they've been moved to this amount. So what happens is the number of imports or foreign goods coming into this country declines as a result of the tariff. So instead of it being from Q1 to Q4, that difference is now Q2 to Q3. But here's the good part of it, if you can call it a good part. You now have between Q2 and Q3 this area of E, that difference between the world price and the world price with the tariff, which would be the tariff amount. Every unit coming in from the foreign country will be taxed, this tariff. And so the government's actually going to gain this area of E. They get to keep that area E as a tariff. And in some countries, that area can actually be really important. It's money that the government otherwise wouldn't have, and they can put it to use. In a country such as the US and most developed countries, there's probably no, in quotes, need for this area other than you're protecting the US firm. Now, what you also want to notice here is that between Q1 and Q2, this little triangular area here and this little triangular area over here, these points, this D and F, those are the deadweight losses, because these are the areas that neither the consumer or the producer will receive in terms of surplus, and it's the areas that the government won't receive either in terms of tax revenue. So that's what we mean by deadweight loss. It's an area that nobody gets to get. So usually, you know, if the consumer surplus goes up, the producer surplus goes down, but the loss of producer surplus goes to the consumer. It goes to someone. But in this case, it doesn't go to anyone. And that's the reason why, as I cannot stress enough, tariffs are generally opposed by most economists. I'm hoping this helped, and we'll go on to the last question very briefly. Okay, so for this last question, I actually don't really think I need to give some guidance, because everything we've been doing, I think you'll be fine answering this question. I'll give you one hint. Just keep in mind, in this market right here, it's showing you that the world price is above the equilibrium price. So think to yourself, what does that mean? The world price is higher than in the domestic market. So that's going to mean that the domestic firms can now benefit by selling their product on the world market, meaning they're going to want to export their products overseas. So as you go through, you know, just keep in mind, you know, whose perspective these questions are being asked from, and you'll notice there'll be a change of country and scenario, so just watch yourself as you go through. But you were doing this in questions 1 and 2, so I don't think you'll have trouble with this.